Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we transform your stack of source material into clear, focused, and unforgettable insight.
Hello.
Today, we're shelving the epic political narratives for a bit, and the glorious military histories of Rome. We're looking straight at the ancient ledger books.
That's right. Our mission today is a deep dive into the very core of Roman power,
Right.
the economics of the elite.
Exactly.
We're tracking these specific mechanisms, land deals, the conquest, the financial innovations, and, the corruption that engineered their immense fortunes.
And we're covering a massive span of time here.
We are, from the earliest agrarian roots under the monarchy, through the height of the empire's global finance, and right into the fragmentation that, well, it set the stage for medieval Europe.
Okay, let's unpack this. When we talk about Rome, I think most of us, we visualize the emperors in their purple robes, the vast marble monuments.
The spectacle.
The spectacle, yeah. But behind that was a structural system of wealth creation and extraction that wasn't just efficient, it was astonishingly durable.
It really was.
We aren't just recounting history here. We are charting the full multi-century life cycle of one of the longest-lasting wealth systems ever devised.
And the sources provide a really granular look at the economic reality that was just humming away beneath the state's political structure.
Yeah.
The ultimate insight here, I think, is that in Rome, wealth was never merely the consequence of political power. It was simultaneously the primary engine and the primary reward of that power. They were totally inseparable.
A perfect feedback loop.
Exactly. And we're tracking this dynamic through three critical economic phases. The initial era of strict agrarian control, then the age of commercial exploitation fueled by conquest, and finally, the dramatic era of imperial centralization.
And what truly stands out for the learner, for you, is seeing this complete evolution. It's fascinating.
It is.
It starts as this localized power derived from owning, simple farmland.
Mud and seeds, basically.
Right. Then it evolves into a global, complex machine powered by speculative capitalism and debt. And then, remarkably, it devolves back into localized, fortified structures that directly gave rise to feudalism.
And through it all, the resilience of this elite class, regardless of whether Rome was a monarchy, a republic, or an empire, that's the foundational lesson we're pulling out of this material.
So, to truly understand the global Roman Empire and its wealth, you have to start with the basics. You said it before, mud and seeds.
That's it.
Our sources are unambiguous about Rome's earliest economic reality under the monarchy. Wealth was rudimentary. It was strictly tied to land ownership and livestock.
Yeah, currency was. It was an afterthought, really.
So why did this agrarian foundation become so enduring? Why was land everything?
Because it represented the only truly reliable, tangible and inheritable form of economic stability in what was a very uncertain world.
Right. Before banks and global supply chains.
Exactly. Before there were sophisticated banking networks or complex logistics, land ownership was destiny. It provided sustenance, it provided security and continuity.
It's real. You can stand on it.
You can. And if you controlled the productive capacity of the soil around the nascent city, you controlled the food supply. And therefore, you control the population. It's that simple.
And this immediately created the hierarchy that would endure for centuries. We are talking about the patrician families who formed the bedrock of early Roman society. Names that became legendary, like the Cornelii and Fabii.
Right. And these families, it's important to remember, they were not initially lauded for military conquest or constitutional genius. That came later. First and foremost, they were simply the original land barons.
They just owned the best stuff.
They owned the best stuff. They established their dominance by controlling the most fertile land in the immediate vicinity of Rome and the surrounding region of Latium. This wasn't an incidental benefit of their status. It was their status.
The two were the same.
One and the same. The sources highlight that in those early centuries, political authority and agrarian wealth were completely intertwined. If you possessed significant land holdings, you automatically qualified for the highest offices, and you dominated the structure of the early state.
So the Senate wasn't really a political body in our sense.
Not at first. In effect, it functioned as the collective board of directors for a handful of wealthy landowning families.
So if the rule is wealth equals land, the entire economic and political game becomes centered on how these families accumulate and, more importantly, how they hold on to that land across generations.
Yes.
Even when the state, first the king, then the republic, is theoretically conquering new territory for all citizens.
Well, that's the key, isn't it? The mechanism of accumulation was deeply strategic and generational. The early kings, recognizing the need for a citizen army, would distribute smaller parcels of newly conquered territory among common citizens.
To keep them loyal.
To ensure loyalty and provide soldiers, sure. However, the patricians were not reliant on these sporadic royal handouts.
They had their own system.
They had their own system. They were continuously accumulating property, using sophisticated strategies of alliances, strategic marriages, and inheritances. They consolidated existing holdings, turning early advantage and local control into truly vast dynastic property empires. The foundation of Roman elite power was, effectively, a land monopoly built over centuries.
And when the monarchy was overthrown, the shift to the republic fundamentally did not disrupt this economic power structure.
Not at all. It just entrenched it.
It changed the political title. It removed the king. But the new ruling families, the same wealthy landholders, just institutionalized their own power.
That is the crucial transition point.
Yeah.
The patrician families who engineered the replacement of the monarchy with the republic were the exact same people who controlled all the fertile land.
So they just cut out the middleman.
They cut out the king. They immediately moved to secure the state's most valuable assets, newly conquered territory, through formalized legal mechanisms that just so happened to benefit their class.
And this brings us to the monopolizing of the public domain.
Yes, the famous ager publicus.
We need to spend time defining this because it is so central to understanding the economic engine of the republic and, well, the subsequent massive inequality that plagued it.
Absolutely. Ager publicus literally translates to public land.
Land of the people.
In theory,
Yeah.
these were the immense territories Rome gained from successful military campaigns, initially against regional rivals like the Etruscans and Sabines. In theory, this land belonged to the entire Roman people, to the state.
But in reality,
Historical evidence suggests that these vast new territories were immediately and thoroughly monopolized by the aristocrats. They used state mechanisms like long-term leases and outright appropriations, often achieved through legal maneuvering, to bring this public domain under their private management.
so common citizens fought and bled to conquer this land.
Mm-hmm.
And the only people who ultimately benefited were the already wealthy few who were able to just absorb those lands into their ever-growing estates.
Yes. It sounds less like a flawed system and more like a system perfectly designed to funnel collective success into private hands.
It was incredibly effective at concentrating capital.
And the means by which they maintained this colossal, geographically diverse agricultural wealth and the political control derived from it was the entrenched patron-client system.
Right. This wasn't just a social tradition, was it?
Oh no, it was the essential economic and political machinery holding the entire elite structure together.
Explain the powerful dual function of this system for the elite landowner.
Well, it was a symbiotic, but, a highly unequal relationship. Poor citizens, the clients, would pledge their unwavering loyalty and service to their elite patrons.
And this service was crucial.
Absolutely. It involved providing political support votes in the assemblies, which were essential for a patron seeking office or military service, or simply labor.
And in return,
In exchange, the patron provided protection, legal aid, occasional handouts of food or money, and sometimes small plots of tenanted land.
so the system served two essential elite functions.
That's right. One, it ensured political loyalty and a reliable stream of votes to maintain their hold on political offices. And two, it provided a cheap, stable labor supply for their rapidly expanding agricultural estates.
So it becomes a self-reinforcing feedback loop.
Perfect way to put it.
Land wealth secured political power. And that political power secured the legal right to appropriate more land and the social mechanism clientage to staff it cheaply.
Precisely. And what's fascinating here is that the creation of the Republic, ostensibly designed to prevent tyranny, to prevent a single king, actually just formalized and institutionalized the pre-existing power of a few dynastic landed families.
They replaced one king with a committee of kings.
A powerful, exclusive oligarchic council, exactly. They leveraged state expansion, paid for by the common citizen's sacrifice, to structurally enrich themselves. And this established a constant tension in Roman society, those who owned the land and those who fought to win it.
So this institutionalization of land monopoly became the fundamental economic template that would dominate for centuries.
Here's the blueprint.
Okay, so if the first section was about slow generational accumulation through strategic land management, Section 2 describes a shift to hyperspeed, systemic enrichment fueled by global military success. And the catalyst for this dramatic shift is undeniably the Punic Wars.
Oh, absolutely. The Punic Wars, waged primarily against Carthage between 264 and 146 BC, were the definitive turning point for the Roman economy.
This is where Rome goes global.
This is where Rome becomes a superpower. Its victory established it as the undisputed heavyweight of the Mediterranean, and the sheer magnitude of the acquired resources. The sources call it a true wealth shock. It transformed the Roman financial landscape almost overnight.
We're talking about an unprecedented influx of wealth and capital into the hands of the state and, of course, the commanding generals.
Indeed, generals, particularly those leading the campaigns like members of the powerful Scipio family, returned to Rome not just with glory, but with colossal material treasures.
Real physical loot.
Massive quantities of gold, silver, precious metals seized from defeated treasuries, priceless art. The scale of this instantaneous injection of wealth was so staggering that we have that incredible historical detail.
This is one of my favorite facts from the sources.
It's amazing. Taxes levied on Roman citizens were actually suspended for a century.
Just think about that. A state generating so much externally acquired capital that it could completely alleviate the tax burden on its own citizenry for 100 years.
It funded immense public works. It gave the elite unparalleled domestic political stability. For a while, at least.
It was the ultimate, albeit temporary, dividend of imperialism.
Right. But the sources remind us that immediate loot is temporary. Gold and silver get spent.
So what was the long game?
The true long-term wealth machine, the sustainable economic engine, came from the sustained, systematic exploitation of the new territories Rome had conquered.
This marks the crucial shift in focus. The Roman elite moved from simply controlling the land around Rome to structurally controlling entire productive regions overseas.
The whole game changed. The focus shifted to the new lucrative provinces like Sicily, Hispania, and Africa.
These territories became the structural foundation of the Republican economy.
They did. The Senate would dispatch a provincial governor, a high-ranking magistrate, usually a senator, who essentially functioned as an autocrat in his territory for his term.
With no real checks and balances.
Very few. These governors had near total authority to levy heavy taxes, requisition essential resources, and engage in widespread, often overt extortion. Oversight was minimal and usually politically motivated, not ethical.
And those provinces were required to supply the two most essential commodities needed to keep the Roman elite hyper-wealthy and the restless urban population docile.
The first, and this was critical for political stability in the city, was grain.
The bread and circuses.
Exactly. Provincial grain, particularly from the immense estates in Sicily and later North Africa, was vital. It ensured the city of Rome was fed, which subsidized the populace and prevented the riots that political stability depended on.
And the second commodity, which massively fueled the profitability of the estates back in Italy, was slaves.
Precisely. Conquered populations were captured and imported wholesale, filling the latifundia, the massive Italian estates. This continuous influx of cheap, forced labor was the key to maximizing aristocratic profits.
And critically, this hyper-profitable slave labor, it had a devastating effect on the small farmers back home.
It completely undermined and displaced them. The traditional small farmers of Italy simply could not compete with the low cost of production on the aristocratic estates.
So this is where the structural economic mechanism leads directly to massive political instability.
It's a direct line. You're talking about the displacement of the very citizens who formed the backbone of the army, pushing them off their land and into the urban sprawl of Rome, creating a landless, impoverished class.
A dangerous class.
A very dangerous and politically radicalized class. The elite's economic strategy of monopolizing ager publicus and then staffing those vast estates with cheap slave labor destabilized the entire republic.
So when these displaced small farmers, the military voters, returned home from campaigning,
they came home to find their land sold or seized and their families impoverished, and they were understandably furious. This economic imbalance directly contributed to the social unrest and civil wars, the Gracchi brothers' land reforms, the conflicts of Marius and Sulla that tore the republic apart in the 1st century BC.
And the mechanism used to extract this provincial wealth was often defined by institutionalized abuse.
Yes.
And this is perfectly illustrated by our poster child of corruption, the infamous case of Gaius Verus, the governor of Sicily.
The prosecution of Verres by Cicero in 70 BC is a deep dive into how the system actually functioned. Verres was known for extortion, illegal requisitions, and looting vast quantities of art and treasury from the Sicilians to an obscene degree.
Cicero's speeches against him are just brutal.
They are. His lengthy indictment details how Verres essentially ran Sicily as his personal bank vault for 3 years.
And the sources suggest that this level of greed wasn't a sudden departure from norms. It was more like an acceleration of what was already expected.
That's the key. The system was predicated on a governor enriching himself to recoup his political investment and elevate his family fortune. The only rule was, don't get caught, or at least don't trigger a political backlash in Rome.
And Verres pushed it too far.
He pushed the boundaries way too far, generating widespread outrage in the province and giving Cicero the perfect political platform to expose the institutionalized rot.
So the Verres case wasn't an anomaly.
Not at all. It shows that sustained, high-level exploitation of the provinces wasn't a flaw in Roman governance. It was a necessary, accepted economic mechanism required to keep the elite structure funded.
Here's where it gets really interesting. While the old landed elite, the Senate, were busy running provinces and dealing in land and plunder, the sheer complexity of the expanding empire created a massive vacuum for new financial services.
A whole new ecosystem.
A whole new class emerged, finding revolutionary ways to monetize the empire's logistical needs, moving beyond physical assets and into abstract finance.
This new class represented a fundamental and often jarring shift. It was a move from the inherited, static agrarian wealth of the patricians to a dynamic, rapidly acquired commercial and financial wealth. We're talking about the emergence of the Equites, or the knights.
And we should clarify the distinction here. The traditional senatorial aristocracy, by law, was often restricted from direct large-scale commerce.
Right. There was this old idea that true honor came only from the land. A bit of a pretense, but it was there.
The Equites bypassed all that.
Precisely. The Equites were defined by their wealth, which often rivaled or even exceeded that of the senators, but their status derived from their commercial activity, not their inherited land titles or magisterial office.
And where did their fortunes come from?
They came from the volatile, yet high-growth sectors of the economy: commerce, international trade, banking, and critically real estate speculation.
They were the risk takers.
They were the high-risk investors, the infrastructure contractors, and the merchant bankers of the late Republic, the first true practitioners of speculative capitalism on a global scale.
And the ultimate, almost legendary symbol of this new wealth, who understood perfectly how to leverage political instability for personal gain, is Marcus Licinius Crassus.
Crassus is the perfect case study. He wasn't simply rich. He engineered his fortune through a combination of battlefield rewards and utterly ruthless business practices.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
Sources estimate his fortune at an astonishing 170 million sesterces.
Which is?
It made him arguably the richest private citizen Rome had ever seen. He fundamentally operated by finding weaknesses in the state and monetizing chaos.
So let's elaborate on his methods for rapid asset acquisition, starting with how he exploited the civil wars.
Okay, so during the chaotic, bloody period of Sulla's dictatorship in the 80s BC, Sulla instituted proscriptions.
Basically a public hit list.
A public list of political rivals condemned to death. Their property was immediately confiscated and sold cheaply by the state. Crassus bought up the confiscated properties of these condemned citizens in massive, bulk-securing urban blocks, villas, and vast rural tracts at fire sale prices.
His fortune was literally built on the political downfall and physical ruin of his opponents.
Yes. And then we have the famous, almost mythical private fire brigade anecdote.
This one really encapsulates his predatory approach to real estate.
It's the ultimate example of entrepreneurial ruthlessness. Rome, being tightly packed and prone to fire, needed organized public safety.
Which it didn't really have.
Not in a public sense. So Crassus maintained a private army of thousands of slaves, including skilled laborers, architects, and a highly efficient private fire brigade.
And when a fire broke out,
Crassus's men would arrive. But rather than immediately dousing the flames, Crassus or his agent would enter negotiations with the desperate owner.
Unbelievable.
They would refuse to extinguish the fire until the owner agreed to sell the burning property, and often the neighboring structures, to Crassus at a drastically low agreed-upon price.
So he essentially leveraged a citywide public safety emergency, the destruction of his neighbor's property, into a forced urban real estate monopoly.
It's high-stakes asset acquisition. He wasn't waiting for crops to ripen. He was actively making immense money from destruction and desperation.
And that highlights the difference between the old wealth and the new.
It really does. The patricians focused on dynastic stability and long-term land yield. Crassus, the Equite, focused on rapid asset acquisition, opportunistic investment, and aggressive cash flow. He redefined what wealth meant in Rome.
But the Equites were more than just individual opportunists like Crassus. They became the logistical backbone and the financiers of the entire empire.
They were essential. They handled long-distance trade, established large banking operations that spanned the Mediterranean, and, most infamously, were the state's mechanism for wealth extraction, the publicani.
The tax farmers.
Yes, the tax farmers. They were the engine of imperial profit extraction. See, the Roman state required massive amounts of capital immediately to fund its massive armies and infrastructure projects.
And waiting for provincial taxes to trickle in over a year was too slow.
Inefficient and politically cumbersome. So they outsourced the risk and the collection.
Walk us through the mechanism of tax farming. How did it work?
It was a brutal but simple profit model, dependent on liquidity and risk assessment. Groups of equites would form joint stock companies, some of the earliest forms of public-private partnerships.
Right.
They would pay the Roman state a substantial lump sum up front for the right to collect taxes in a specific wealthy province, like Asia Minor or Gaul.
And in doing so, the publicani assumed the risk of non-collection.
Right. But the potential reward was astronomical.
And their method for profit was simple.
Very. They then went into the province and collected not just the required state tax, but a massive surcharge to cover their operating costs, the cost of capital, and their vast profit margins.
They systematically overtaxed the provincial populations.
Yeah. And worse. They often extended loans to struggling municipalities or individuals to cover the tax payment, trapping them in debt at exorbitant interest rates, which the publicani then used the full weight of Roman law to enforce.
So the historical accounts describe this as
Arguably the most profitable yet corrupt enterprises in Roman history. And this wasn't a peripheral corruption, it was the entire system of imperial finance.
so private enterprise, embodied by the Equites, integrated seamlessly with state exploitation.
And ensured that the wealth extracted from conquest flowed directly and efficiently into the hands of the Roman elite.
Which raises an important question. Why did the Senate, the old landed elite, who often viewed the Equites as these vulgar commercial upstarts, why did they allow this class to become so financially powerful and essential?
Because they had to. The empire had become too vast, too complex, and the financial demands too sophisticated for the traditional agrarian families to manage alone.
They couldn't handle the logistics.
Governing a global empire required massive liquid capital, sophisticated banking networks, and complex logistical operations that the senatorial class, focused primarily on land and political office, simply could not provide.
So they needed them.
They needed the Equites. They provided the crucial capital and, frankly, the ruthlessness required to run a global system. This created a political and financial codependence that defined the late Republic and ultimately led to intense internal political strife.
The very chaos and civil wars that allowed speculators like Crassus to flourish also proved that the Republic was unsustainable. When too much wealth and military power were scattered among rival elites, the state imploded. The transition to the empire, secured by the rise of Augustus, changes the entire structure of elite wealth forever by concentrating it.
That's the defining characteristic of the imperial age. The state solved the problem of civil strife and political instability by centralizing virtually all political and critically economic power into one single, unchallengeable figure.
The emperor, who instantly became, by structural definition, the world's single richest man.
Without question. The consolidation of political authority meant the consolidation of assets and revenue streams on a scale never before seen. The sources meticulously detail the specific assets that gave the emperor's fortune its unparalleled status.
So what were these unassailable sources of imperial wealth?
Well, the primary source was the ownership of Egypt's fertile lands. After the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra, Augustus treated Egypt not as a standard province run by a senator, but as the personal private domain of the emperor, his personal piggy bank, a very, very large one. Controlling Egypt meant controlling the single most crucial and reliable breadbasket of the entire Mediterranean. This gave the emperor leverage over the food supply that no rival could politically or economically match.
And the second major source?
Absolute control over the empire's gold and silver mines, effectively giving the emperor control over the currency itself.
So controlling the food supply and the money supply, that creates an unbeatable economic monopoly, both politically and financially.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this concentration led to the blurring of lines between private wealth and public funds that defined the imperial age. Over time, the imperial family's private fortune, known as the fiscus, effectively equaled, and often surpassed, the traditional state treasury, the agrarian.
So the emperor's personal purse became the state's operative budget.
In a very real sense, yes.
Hmm.
This centralization was the structural culmination of centuries of Roman expansion, now all feeding a single source of power.
This immense wealth wasn't just a symbol of status, though. It was the ultimate tool of political control,
It was.
used by the emperor to manage the loyalty, the career prospects, and the existential fear of the entire elite class.
Exactly. This management was achieved through the sophisticated system of imperial gifts and patronage. Major land grants, lucrative governorships, military commands, political offices, these were no longer the result of open senatorial competition.
They became
Imperial gifts, used explicitly to reward loyalty, cement alliances, and ensure the financial stability of the emperor's key allies. If an elite family wanted to attain or retain massive wealth, their primary task was to please the emperor, because he was the sole gatekeeper of economic opportunity.
And the flip side of that imperial benevolence was the constant power of fear that kept the aristocracy in line.
The power to confiscate estates at will. This was the emperor's nuclear option for political and economic control.
And it must have created an atmosphere of
Perverse stability for loyalists, but constant existential fear among even the most established elite families. Though they might be billionaires on paper, their entire fortune could be stripped away overnight by a simple charge of treason, often manufactured by imperial informers, the delators.
And we see the vulnerability of even the most powerful men in Rome in cases involving families like the Senecas and Pisos.
Absolutely. Despite their vast personal riches and deep influence, they were completely dependent on the emperor's whim.
Take Seneca.
Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher, accumulated astonishing wealth while serving as Nero's advisor, often through imperial gifts and shrewd investments.
And
Yet, when he fell under suspicion of disloyalty, Nero forced his suicide, and his staggering personal wealth was immediately confiscated. The message was clear across the whole elite. Your personal wealth means nothing if the emperor revokes your property rights.
this period, then, spanning the first 2 centuries AD, marked the peak of Roman economic centralization.
It really did. The single ruler controlled not just the means of production, the food, the mines, the trade contracts, but also the absolute authority over property rights and the mechanisms of patronage that determined every elite's success story.
It was an incredibly efficient machine for wealth concentration, which provided 2 centuries of relative peace.
It did, but it simultaneously hollowed out the functional independence and resilience of the traditional aristocracy. They became powerful bureaucrats and really tenants of the emperor's centralized system rather than independent dynastic forces.
Which ultimately prepared the ground for systemic fragility when that central system inevitably started to fail.
Exactly.
The imperial system, for all its efficiency and durability, was fundamentally dependent on 2 things: a stable, honest currency and secure trade routes, both enforced by the emperor's legions.
Yes.
As resilient as that centralized engine was, it encountered catastrophic failure starting in the 3rd century AD.
The 3rd century crisis was not just a political problem, it was a devastating economic collapse. The centralized system that relied on global trade and confidence in the coinage began to unravel spectacularly under the strain of constant civil wars and external invasions.
What were the key symptoms of this economic breakdown that directly impacted the elite's wealth management?
The primary symptom was crippling inflation,
And that was driven by
primarily driven by systematic debasement of the coinage. Emperors constantly needing to raise massive funds to pay ever-demanding armies and fund constant civil wars systematically reduced the actual precious metal content in silver coins,
they were watering down the money.
watering it down with cheaper alloys like copper. By the mid-3rd century, the official silver coin contained barely 5% silver.
Which destroyed public faith in money.
Completely. And at the same time, trade routes became unsafe due to political instability and invasions. The complex logistical networks that had enriched the Equites and supplied Rome broke down almost entirely.
So when centralized commerce fails, people stop trusting abstract money or distant centralized banks.
They do.
They return to what is tangible and local. It's a flight to real assets.
It's a massive structural economic shift. Wealth relocated drastically from volatile commerce and vulnerable urban centers back to the only reliable asset: self-sufficient rural estates. The elite began to prioritize local control, security, and direct production over long-distance trade profit.
And this is where we see the rise of the latifundia in their final crucial form. They are no longer just agricultural estates.
No, they become powerful, decentralized, quasi-political kingdoms. The latifundia were forced to become self-sufficient, fortified economic islands.
Because the state couldn't protect them anymore.
As the central government weakened and its army could no longer guarantee safety from bandits or invading groups, the aristocrats had to provide their own security. The owner of the latifundium essentially began to rule his estate like a localized magistrate, maintaining his own armed retainers, often collecting taxes meant for the state, and offering legal protection and justice to the people dependent on his land.
And the labor structure on these estates also changed fundamentally. This is a key precursor to feudalism.
It is.
They moved away from the slave labor that defined the republic.
That is a critical technical distinction. Due to the breakdown of conquest in the 3rd century, the supply of fresh slaves dried up dramatically.
So they needed a new labor source.
To maintain labor and production, the estates increasingly relied on a system of tenant farmers known as the colony. These colonies were theoretically free citizens, but legal reforms increasingly tied them to the land they worked. They paid rent, usually in crops, and were subject to the jurisdiction of the landowner.
So the colonies were not chattel slaves, but they couldn't leave the land, which creates the foundational relationship between a lord and his dependent peasant that defined the Middle Ages.
It is the direct foreshadowing of medieval serfdom. Economic power shifted entirely from the central state, which could no longer effectively collect taxes or enforce imperial law, to localized, self-sufficient, militarized land control. The landowner became the primary source of security and law in the face of imperial collapse.
Then comes the final transition. After the official fall of Rome in 476 AD in the West, the Roman elite didn't just disappear or get wiped out. They proved their remarkable adaptability once again.
The Roman aristocracy realized that their land titles and their sophisticated legal knowledge were their most durable assets. Many Roman elites allied directly with the new barbarian rulers, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain.
They just changed allegiance.
They merged their existing land power and their administrative skills into the nascent order of the new kingdoms, transitioning from Roman senatorial power into early feudal lords. This ensured the continuity of their land-based power structures right into the medieval period, despite the change in political management.
And the other great institution that absorbed, protected, and ultimately expanded its wealth during this fragmentation was, of course, the church.
Absolutely. The Catholic Church emerged as the single most stable and rapidly growing landowner. As civil life collapsed and many aristocrats sought spiritual security, they often donated vast amounts of land and wealth to the church upon their death or conversion.
And noble sons entering the clergy.
That also channeled family assets into the church structure. This made the church the new, safe repository of dynastic wealth and land titles, ensuring that the legacy of Roman aristocratic wealth survived the political fragmentation of the West.
So the economic trajectory went full circle. The high point of the Republic was defined by dynamic, complex commercial wealth via the Equites, but the late Roman world retreated completely.
It did. The value of volatile coinage plummeted, and wealth was definitively measured by the control of fortified land and dependence, particularly the cloners, who were tied to the soil and loyal to the local lord who could provide protection.
Signaling the complete transition from complex imperial capitalism.
And the world of massive joint stock companies and global banking.
Back to decentralized agrarian feudal economics where local power and tangible security ruled supreme.
A total reset.
So what does this all mean for us? The Roman elite's centuries-long strategy wasn't just about accumulating personal riches.
No.
It was about building incredibly durable economic systems, conquest, systematic corruption, and deep centralization systems so robust they survived the collapse of the central state itself by simply morphing their structures into the next dominant geopolitical form.
I think we can summarize the 4 key themes and insights we've pulled from this material.
Let's do it.
First, land is power. It was the single constant. It was the ultimate, safest, and most inheritable source of wealth across all periods, from the earliest patricians to the medieval bishops.
Right. Commercial wealth was dynamic and could collapse.
The land endured.
Second, corruption as mechanism. We saw that the exploitation of the provinces and the monopolization of public lands wasn't merely a moral failure that destabilized the state.
No, for the elite, it was a necessary and normalized economic mechanism that fueled the state's operations and rewarded its ruling class with generational riches.
It wasn't a bug, it was a feature.
It was the feature. Third, economic evolution. We track the full circle of economic evolution, from simple agrarian roots through a highly sophisticated period of commercial capitalism symbolized by the equities and the publicani.
And then a structural collapse that forced a retreat back to decentralized, fortified feudal land control.
Exactly.
And fourth, continuity and consequence. The very tools, systematic conquest and exploitation that built Rome's power, allowing them to suspend taxes for a century.
Incredible.
Those were the same tools that ultimately destroyed the economic resilience of the small farmer, destabilized the currency through debasement, and made centralized trade too dangerous, forcing that final transition to localized self-sufficiency.
And understanding Rome's economic foundations, it provides a powerful lens through which to view later Western history. The origins of our concepts of private property rights, the structural inequality inherent in tax systems, the genesis of feudal land tenure.
It's all here.
It all lies in the ruthless adaptations and mechanisms of the Roman elite trying to keep their money and power safe, regardless of whether they were serving a senate, an emperor, or a barbarian king.
And that leads us to a final provocative thought for you to explore as you consider this material. If the Roman elite, in the face of currency collapse and political chaos, chose decentralized, self-sufficient, and fortified land control over the complex mechanisms of globalized commerce and imperial finance to preserve their wealth, what does that choice tell us about the perceived fragility of globalized financial systems, even at their peak?
That's a great question.
Was their final radical choice a reflection that true, enduring stability is always found closer to the soil?
Welcome to The Debate. Our subject today is, well, it's foundational to understanding Roman society, the enduring question of how the elite secured and maintained their immense wealth. We're going to be diving into the source material to trace the evolution of that wealth, all the way from the city's early days under the monarchy right through the empire.
And the central question here is so critical, because how you answer it really dictates how you interpret Roman political history. Was the enduring dominance of the Roman elite primarily secured by that foundational, stable control of agrarian land? You know, the thing that gave them continuous generational power? Or was it actually driven by the intense, profitable machinery of imperial exploitation and financial speculation?
Exactly. And I'm going to argue that land ownership remained the ultimate defining source of wealth and power. It was the stable foundation that dictated political legitimacy and, frankly, provided the continuity for all other economic activity, no matter what phase Rome was in.
And I'll be coming at it from a slightly different angle. While, of course, no one denies land was the baseline, I contend that the sheer scale and transformative power of wealth that defined Rome, the wealth that destabilized the Republic and financed the empire, came primarily from those aggressive, high-risk, high-reward ventures, things rooted in conquest, provincial exploitation, and some pretty sophisticated speculative finance.
So my position really emphasizes continuity and political structure. If we look at Rome's very beginning, the source material is pretty clear that the earliest patrician families, we're talking about the Cornelii, the Fabii, the oldest clans, they established their dominance by controlling the most fertile lands. In that early phase, before coinage was even widespread, wealth was simple. It was the soil and it was the flocks. Land ownership was, at that point, inseparable from political authority. The landowners formed the Senate and immediately dominated the state. As the Republic grew, they used these really complex systems of alliances and inheritances to ensure that this early agrarian control translated into generational, dynastic power. They weren't just farmers, they were the ruling class because they controlled the means of subsistence. And what's even more telling is the endgame. When the empire began to destabilize and currency became worthless in the 3rd and 4th centuries, wealth didn't flow to banks or trading ports. It shifted back, overwhelmingly, to these self-sufficient rural estates, the latifundia.
Right.
The aristocrats basically became local kings, which just demonstrates the land's supreme ability to provide stability when everything else, commerce, currency, the state itself, had failed.
I grant you that the stability point is crucial, but I worry we're conflating stability with true economic power and magnitude. Land provided the foundation, I agree, like a sturdy stone foundation, but the magnificent, sprawling structure of imperial Roman wealth, that was built on loot and leveraging state power.
I'm not sure I'd put it that way.
Well, the truly immense wealth, the kind that changed Roman life forever, started flowing after the Punic Wars. You have generals like Scipio Africanus returning with so much gold and silver. The taxes on Roman citizens in Italy were suspended for a century. I mean, that is a scale of enrichment that's just utterly impossible to achieve through farming alone. And then the systematic long-term profit came from exploiting captured territories, provinces like Sicily, Hispania, Africa. Governors levied crushing taxes and engaged in rampant extortion. You can see the mechanism so clearly in texts like Cicero's prosecution of Gaius Verus, who basically treated Sicily as his personal bank. And finally, you cannot ignore the radical rise of the Equites, the knights, a new class that built fortunes through finance, banking, and most importantly, tax farming, where they were known as the publicani. This system was one of the most profitable and most corrupt in Roman history. Their wealth came from the state's imperial reach, not their fields.
Okay, but this brings us to a core point, and I'd argue that even your examples of exploitation were just an extension of that foundational land wealth. Let's talk about the ager publicus, the vast tracts of public land taken over by aristocrats during the Republic. You call it political muscle? And it was, but that muscle was used to cement the continuity of land control, just scaled up. The monopoly of the ager publicus directly ensured a cheap, stable labor supply. The massive influx of slaves from conquest, which you correctly mentioned, made the land highly profitable, yes. But that profit was only realized when you actually possessed the land to put the slaves on. This whole system tied political loyalty, the patron-client structure, directly to agrarian production. The land wasn't just dirt, it was the ultimate stable collateral that defined elite status and provided generational security. If you controlled the land, you controlled everything else.
I see why you emphasize stability, but I think framing the ager publicus as just land wealth really misrepresents its function in the mature republic. It wasn't about the quality of the soil. It was about political leverage being monetized. The profitability of those estates was completely dependent on two preconditions delivered by imperial expansion. First, the state's creation of a massive slave market through conquest, which dropped labor costs to almost nothing.
A fair point.
And second, the political power of the Senate to monopolize those state resources, basically overriding the rights of smaller farmers. Without the imperial engine supplying the slaves and the corruption enabling the monopoly, that land would have just gone back to subsistence farming. The real asset was the political power. The land was just where that power was exercised.
But that power was held by the landowners.
Can't accept that the immense wealth of someone like Marcus Licinius Crassus was a sideline activity. Crassus was worth an estimated 170 million sesterces. I mean, to put that in context, that fortune could have funded a legion for years. His wealth wasn't grown on a farm. It was generated through pure speculation, buying up confiscated properties, in his infamous fire brigade that he used to acquire burning buildings at rock-bottom prices. The rise of the Equites, who were fundamentally commercial, signaled a true shift. Finance and aggressive real estate speculation had become central to elite success.
Crassus's enterprises were certainly dramatic, bordering on criminal, but I'd maintain they were unusual. The Senate, which held the real dynastic power, was overwhelmingly controlled by the old patrician families who maintained their status through inherited land. Commercial wealth, precisely because it was volatile and destabilizing, was viewed with a lot of suspicion. The Equites often used land as collateral, true, but their primary engine was high-risk commerce tied entirely to political whim and military campaigns. The land, on the other hand, was the stable foundation. If Crassus lost a speculative venture, he was still rich. If a traditional patrician family lost its inherited land, they lost their legacy. Stability defines the long game.
Okay.
And let's look at the ultimate centralization of power under Augustus. You'd think that would prioritize finance, but it actually reinforces the land argument. The emperor became the richest man in the world primarily by owning territory directly. His personal family fortune, which famously equaled the entire state treasury, was anchored by his control of Egypt's fertile lands. Egypt was treated as the emperor's personal estate, ensuring massive, consistent revenue. This shows that even in the imperial phase, the most effective mechanism of power was control over the most valuable land.
That's a compelling point about Egypt, but we have to look at the nature of that control. The emperor's power wasn't just owning the land. It was decentralized, absolute power to confiscate and redistribute estates at will. Under Augustus, the line between private imperial wealth and public state wealth just vanished. Governorships and land grants became imperial gifts used to reward loyalty. So this centralization proves that the mechanism of political exploitation, the ability to control all resources, was the dominant factor. The land itself, even Egypt, became a tool of imperial whim, totally dependent on political favor, not an independent source of stability. It was the power to exploit the land, not just own it, that mattered. And I want to push back on the Senate's conservatism too. The traditional families, they were forced to engage with the speculative world. When Hannibal destroyed Italy's farms, the rebuilding required capital that only the Equites and imperial finance could provide. The old guard might have looked down on them, but they were deeply intertwined in the profits from provincial grain sales and state contracts. The land became a massive factory, and you need capital to run a factory that large.
And you need a stable location for that factory. The reason they had to engage with the Equites was because financial wealth was necessary for expansion in short-term campaigns, but it could not buy the dynastic legitimacy that only land conveyed. Let's look at the ultimate test, the collapse.
Okay.
I'm not convinced that the imperial system just broke down. I argue the final shift to feudalism confirms the primacy of land because it endured the collapse. After the 3rd century economic spiral, massive inflation, worthless coins, the entire commercial infrastructure vanished. When all that failed, wealth was once again measured by the control of fortified land and the people you could protect. This proves that when the elaborate machinery of exploitation fell apart, only the agrarian base remained viable. The Catholic Church, the new stabilizing force, absorbed enormous wealth almost entirely through land donations, cementing land as the only reliable asset.
But the transition to feudalism was a massive failure of the system. It was a failure driven by the inherent instability of that high-stakes, centralized exploitation. The system collapsed because of the very factors that fueled its boom: aggressive extraction from provinces, reliance on unstable trade routes. It was just too volatile and unsustainable. The return to fortified land was a regression, a retreat, precisely because the sophisticated engine of commerce and finance had destroyed itself. It's not that land won, it's that everything else broke.
But the wealth was still located in the land. Even in regression, the enduring asset proved to be the soil, not the ledger books. The patricians who survived became the medieval aristocracy. Their foundational asset was continuous.
The asset was continuous, yes, but the mechanism of wealth creation had fundamentally changed. The magnitude of wealth that defined Rome from the 200s BC to the 200s AD, the wealth that built the Colosseum, that was imperial, extractive, and financial. It was the scale, not the stability, that made Rome a superpower.
So, to summarize my position, while I fully acknowledge that conquest provided these massive, rapid spikes in wealth, the core, enduring source of dynastic power that dictated political authority across millennia, from the original patrician families to the stable latifundias in the church, was the soil. Land provided the necessary security and continuity, where finance provided necessary but dangerous volatility.
And to reiterate my position, the defining characteristic of the Roman elite's success, the vast scale and reach of their wealth, was a direct result of monetizing conquest, corruption, and the innovative financial enterprises of the Equites. Agrarian wealth was the foundation, yes, but imperial exploitation was the powerful transformative engine that delivered wealth on an unprecedented scale, turning Rome from a city-state into a global economic power.
Ultimately, what the source material reveals is, well, it's a complex system. Rome's elite engineered one of history's longest-lasting wealth structures, one that successfully transitioned from agrarian roots to a remarkably sophisticated, aggressive commercial capitalism.
Right. It required both foundational control over the soil and these aggressive state-sanctioned mechanisms of exploitation. And understanding that interplay, whether the root or the engine was truly the most essential element, that continues to illuminate the extraordinary complexity and I'd say the inherent instability built into the heart of Roman power.